The three best REITs to own. So today we're going to go through our methodology for selecting the best REITs, and we've put 4 beginners here, and that's because the method that we're going to use today is very simple. It avoids the complexity that presentations on REITs often get into. So the reason we're doing this presentation is because we did a bit on data center REITs and had quite a few subscribers and readers ask us for more content on REITs. Well, we mainly cover tech stocks at Nanalyze, but REITs are relevant because we manage a portfolio of assets, and more than half of those assets are in our dividend growth investing strategy, Quantigens. And in that portfolio of 30 dividend growth stocks are 3 REITs. Now, they don't happen to be the same REITs that we've said the 3 best REITs are today, and we'll explain to you why that is. But we're going to look at REITs and how you may select ones that help you sleep well at night. So let's start by talking about what a REIT is. So we'll keep this very simple. REITs allow you to have exposure to various property asset classes without direct ownership. So how that works is that investors buy shares in a REIT. That stands for Real Estate Investment Trust. And the REIT takes that money and uses it to acquire properties and then rent them out. And then the rental income is then returned to investors in the form of a distribution. So there are rules around how much money a REIT has to distribute. So it's around 90% of their funds from operations. And the first thing that you're going to notice here is that we start introducing some new acronyms and some new terms. That's because these are very unique vehicles, often very sophisticated vehicles that a clever accountant can manipulate quite well. REITs came about in the 1960s and were meant to give investors exposure to asset classes that they wouldn't have exposure to otherwise, such as commercial property. There's somewhere around 200 or more REITs that are publicly traded on major exchanges, so there's a lot of selection. Now, why do we own REITs? Well, there's 3 main reasons that we hold REITs. One is to provide a diversification effect, since REITs are weakly correlated to the broader stock market. We've talked about why that's important, because when tech stocks are going to hell in a handbasket, it's nice to have other assets that hold their ground so that you don't get entirely depressed when you see all the paper losses on your tech stock. So that diversification effect extends across asset classes like gold or Bitcoin or art or wine, things like that. REITs over time become less and less correlated to the broader stock market the longer you hold them. So we hold them for that diversification effect. We hold them for exposure to realty as an asset class, not residential realty, but other types of realty that we may not be able to access, such as somebody who owns their own home. Well, that's residential realty, and you already have that exposure. And then, of course, we like REITs because they provide a growing stream of income. That's a very important factor as to why we hold REITs in our own portfolio. So we're going to make some assumptions today about the type of person, let's say beginner or expert, that may be watching this presentation. So around 65% of Americans own a home. So we're going to assume that you want exposure outside of residential properties. Now, if you do want exposure to residential properties, there's certainly options, but we're not going to assume that the majority want that exposure. So realty is an income producing asset, so we want a reliable growing stream of income. We don't just want that income stream to terminate at any time for any reason. We want to have very simple metrics to monitor, and most importantly, especially for beginners, we want to SWAN. That means sleep well at night, set it and forget it. So we want REITs that are easy to understand and that we don't have to worry very much about. Low risk. Now, when it comes to selecting a REIT, as we said, there's several hundred. Here you can see the various types. You even have cannabis REITs, farmland, industrial, healthcare, shopping centers, malls, etc. So all kinds of REITs to choose from. And perhaps when people are searching for the best REITs, they're overwhelmed by all the selection. And when they go to try to figure out what the best REITs are, things become complex in a hurry, very complex. So we started out this presentation by trying to dig into some of the metrics based on some of the quite good presentations given out there on how you might go about analyzing REITs. And I'll tell you what, if we wanted to lose our audience right now, we'd start digging into this stuff. It's extremely complicated and boring as hell. So estimating a valuation for a REIT is vastly different from any other company because they have a very unique business model. So all of a sudden we're introducing new metrics. So you have FFO, that's GAAP net income plus depreciation and amortization minus gains from property sales or change in control plus impairments. It's just not anything that anybody wants to navigate, especially when you see that the definition for this key metric can differ by company since it's not a GAAP metric. Well, that's great. So we're not able to compare apples to apples. That's not good. And then since land depreciates, the depreciation charges which appear on a REIT's financials don't accurately represent the true cash flows. That's another problem. And then as a result of all this complexity, net income and earnings per share for a REIT are subject to potentially wild inaccuracies. Then we need to consider debt management. So it's fine for a REIT to have debt. However, when there are problems in the market and REITs are forced to go to the capital markets when it's at their least advantageous, then they run into problems. So you have falling rents, dysfunctional debt market, and a real estate equity market that tanks. Well, REITs that took on a lot of debt when it comes due are facing some difficult choices. So they either need to issue equity at unattractive terms or sell properties into a panicking market. Now, both of these scenarios are not good, especially when they start issuing equity. So think about when a firm buys back shares. What happens to the dividend if everything else stays the same? Well, earnings per share goes up, right? And if the payout ratio stays the same, then your dividend goes up. The reverse happens when you start issuing shares. So that means that your dividend will decrease if all things being equal, if a firm starts issuing equity at unattractive prices. So when we look at REITs, we like to keep it very simple. And it's similar to how a hiring manager vets candidates initially. And that's by saying, what proof do you have of your competency? The humans are incredibly complex. And when you interview somebody, you can pick up on a lot of details in terms of how competent they might be. But what it usually comes down to is what they've accomplished in the past. And you usually probe them on that and figure out, did they do the great things that they said they do? Well, when we look at REITs, because those are extraordinarily complex, we do something very similar. And we say, what's your track record of success? Well, we're going to show you what that looks like. Here's a REIT that's increased their dividend for 54 years in a row. Now, they've put here some of the things that have happened over the last 54 years. You've got the OPEC embargo, you've got inflation, and that's very important to note inflation because that's particularly relevant to a certain type of REIT. You have the Asian crisis, you have the financial crisis of 2009, and look up there in the upper right, the pandemic, the COVID crisis. And over time, this represents about a 6.8% compound annual growth rate, which is extremely powerful. I'll show you why. So a king of dividends. A dividend king is by definition, S&P 500 company that's not only paid a dividend, but increased it every year for at least 50 years. There's only, we say, 40 dividend kings in existence. So the way that we look at a dividend king is doesn't have to necessarily belong to the S&P 500. So let's say there's probably less than 40 companies that have achieved this feat. So here's what a 54-year compound annual growth rate of 6.8% looks like. Let's say you started out 54 years ago at year zero and your yield was 3.92%. So that's what the yield for this REIT is today. This is Federal Realty Trust, FRT. So on year 54, your yield on cost, that means the yield on the original money that you put in, would be 137%. So to put this in another way, starting at year 50, your dividend would have increased so much that now you receive back your initial capital outlay in dividends alone every year, and it's still increasing over time, and you still have your position. So think about Warren Buffett and Coca-Cola. So Warren Buffett bought Coca-Cola back in the 80s. Now his yield on cost is somewhere, let's say, upwards of 50%. That means he gets back half his money that he put in every year. And because Coca-Cola is a dividend king, that keeps increasing over time. So this is a very powerful concept, and companies that are able to achieve such phenomenal track records, they treasure those. Those become sacred. So when we look at Federal's, here's another acronym for you: property operating income. So this is rental income and mortgage interest income less rental expenses and real estate taxes. So we don't care about any of that. We just care, can this company keep increasing their dividend? And one of the reasons that they can is because they're well diversified. Now, they operate in the United States, so there is some risk of just operating within a particular country, but look how well they've been able to weather crisis operating in a single country. You can see here their distribution among these different markets across the United States. So they're geographically diverse. And then when we look at what they actually do, well, they have 104 open air properties with 3,100 commercial tenants and then 3,400 residential units. So there's some commercial, some residential. They have best in class locations, as you saw in the previous slide, where the average household income is upwards of $133,000. And look here on the right, they talk about how over 75% of our centers have a grocery component. That's very important. So REITs that focus on things like groceries, well, people aren't going to stop buying groceries when there's a crisis. So that's important. They make it a point to talk about how 75% of the centers they operate have this grocery component. Grocery stores aren't going anywhere. Now, the question you might have is, well, that's great. Federal Realty Investment Trust sounds like a great firm, but what other companies out there have track records like FRT? That's the ticker. Well, let's talk about champions and aristocrats. So a dividend champion is a firm that has not only paid, but increased their dividend 25 years in a row. So that number is arbitrary, but once you qualify, once you have that label, the record becomes sacred within a company. So they protect that at all costs, especially if they're in the S&P 500. So S&P 500 calls dividend champions dividend aristocrats, which means they've paid, not only paid, but increased their dividend 25 years in a row at least. So when we look at all the REITs out there that have done that, here's the list. So you can look from Realty Income and work your way down. And we've circled one here. That's Universal Health Realty Income Trust. So this is a firm with a market cap of somewhere around $750 million. And we're going to exclude that from this list. So this is our population we're going to look at. These are firms with great track records, but we're going to see which ones we would want to exclude. When it comes to size, we don't invest in firms with $1 billion market cap or less. There's a lot of reasons for that, and I'll put some of that research in the description of this video, but it comes down to the fact that firms under $1 billion in size become very risky. Now, this company, Universal Health Realty Income Trust, has done a great job over the years of raising their income or their dividend for 37 years in a row, but we're excluding that because of size. That's because we're risk-averse tech investors. As we said earlier, we like to sleep well at night. We want to reduce risk. So this is not a company that we would consider. We also wouldn't consider Essex Property Trust, and that's because of their geographic concentration. So many REITs have heavy exposure to the US. That's something that you're going to have to just accept, but at least require diversification by state. 83% of this firm's portfolio, again, we see another acronym here, NOI, 84%, say 83, is exposed to the state of California. Too heavily exposed to California. This isn't a firm that we would invest in. They're also operating in residential real estate. Now, we noticed that speaking of diversification, they mentioned that 51% of their managers are people of color. Well, we had some questions around that. So do they use one of those fans for paint to determine the color? Is it based on percentage that you have to prove by lineage. What exactly is a person of color? Is that an Asian? Is that a Black person? Is that a Chinese person? We're really confused. So if anybody understands what a person of color is and what the requirements are, so my grandmother's 25%, or she's 100% Italian, that makes me 25% Italian. Am I a person of color? Hard to say. So anybody that can provide some color around that metric, that would be great to see. So moving on to talking about the remaining 4 REITs. So we have Realty Income, WP Carey, Federal Realty, that's the one we talked about, and National Retail Properties. So from those 6, we now have 4 remaining that we want to vet. And 3 in green here are what's called triple net REITs. All right, you'll see that another new term to acquaint yourself with, but this one's fairly simple. So check this out. Triple net lease. Start on the left. Single net lease, the tenant is accountable for rent and property tax, and the owner takes care of maintenance and other operating expenses. And then you work your way to the right. When you get to a triple net lease, the tenant is responsible for everything, and the owner is responsible for nothing. So these are more predictable structures. They're more efficient. And according to Hoya Capital, they're a firm that produces a lot of information about REITs. Since 1994, triple net REITs have been the best performing class of REITs out there, best performing sector. So these are desirable vehicles. They're less complex, which is a good thing. So 3 of the REITs that we're going to look at are triple net. So let's take a look at them. Before that, reasons to be bearish. Hoya put this out, and it's great. Looks at why net lease REITs might be a problem. So they're sensitive to interest rates, inflation as well. So they make heavy use of rent escalators based on the consumer price index, while some use fixed rate escalators, which expose them to rising inflation. So as inflation goes up, they could produce negative real rent growth. You have retail exposure, so e-commerce remains a looming threat for retail businesses. There's competition for deals, and maybe that's why we see some of these REITs going international, but there's reasons to be bearish on net lease REITs. Now, again, going back to that track record, if you're able to achieve those track records, then you're able to manage these risks. And that's very important because these risks will always be there. So when we look at a firm like Realty Income, so they're a triple net REIT, and they're a top 10 global REIT. So they actually have some international exposure because they started expanding internationally in 2019. If you look at their investor deck, seriously, it's remarkable how well they've gone through and said, here's how we address risk. So they've been able to increase their dividend for 27 years in a row, and their credit rating is very good. They're one of only 7 US REITs with 2 A3 ratings or better. And in their investor deck, it's remarkable. They do this analysis about retail bankruptcies, and they show you how they don't have any exposure to that. And their focus throughout the entire deck is around making sure they're renting to tenants that are resilient in economic downturns, isolated from economic pressure, or say e-commerce pressure. They talk about their top 20 clients being highly insulated from changing consumer behavior. The entire deck focuses on the stability of their business, and it's really notable when a firm does that. Here's a look at their clients. So top 20 clients there on the left, only one accounts for 4% of revenues, and the rest you can see down the list. That's Walgreens at 4%, 7-Eleven at 3.9%, and it goes down. In the upper right, you can see the categorizations: grocery stores, convenience stores, dollar stores. Again, these are the sorts of tenants that aren't going to go away when there's economic crisis. So they have the property type diversification, geographic diversification, Texas at 10%, and the UK. And on the left, you'll see some UK names there: Tesco, B&Q, and there was another one as well. So this firm is very well diversified when it comes to the type of clients that rent from them, and they've made a real effort to make sure that their risk is minimal in terms of the slide that we saw before, which talks about risks that these REITs face, these triple net REITs face. So another triple net REIT is WP Carey. They're new on the scene. So when we put together this presentation, we were surprised to see that they've now become a dividend champion. They've had 25 years in a row of increasing their dividend. They have a really strong international exposure relative to other REITs that we've looked at today, 35% exposure to Europe. They have quite a high yield, upwards of 5%, and over 99% of their annualized base rent comes from leases with contractual rent increases, including 58% linked to consumer price index. So they make it a point to talk about how they're guarding against the rising inflation. Now, when we look at property and industry diversification, we see that, again, retail stores at 22%, consumer services, you can read this for yourself. So they have some industrial, some warehouses. When we look at the list of clients, the top 10 tenants, which account for 20% of their ABR, again, another acronym there. We've got U-Haul and self-storage properties. And look at these international names: Spain, Germany, Italy, Poland, UK. So some European exposure there, which these days is seen as a bit of a risk. So this is a firm that is a relatively new dividend champion, and they're expanding. They actually are in the process of acquiring another firm, and they're doing a lot of international expansion. So those triple net REITs, the ones we've discussed, Realty Income and WP Carey. The third one is National Retail Properties, the ticker's NNN. This is a relatively small REIT when you compare it to the other two triple net REITs that we've talked about. They lack international diversification, and what we noted here is they have a strong overlap with Realty Income. So why hold this firm when you can just hold Realty Income and get a lot of that same exposure? And it is surprisingly similar exposure. So that's one that we would exclude. So the three firms that we think investors ought to be paying attention to, the three best REITs, the simplest ones with the simple metric, that is, how many years have they increased the dividend that they're paying investors, was Realty Income, WP Carey, and Federal Realty Trust. So other dividend champions, we talked about 6. Hoya Capital claims there's 10, and we haven't seen their list. We weren't able to get our hands on that, but we've identified 6. So we've done a fair amount of research around this in terms of we license data from NASDAQ to run our dividend growth strategy called Quantigens, and we took names from that strategy along with some other sources and came up with 6. So what you can also look at are upcoming dividend champion REITs. So these names: Equity Lifestyle Properties, that's at an 18-year track record. And of course, Digital Realty, we did a presentation on them not too long ago. They're at 18 years. And then next come 5 more REITs that are at 13 years. So they're 9 years away from becoming champions. And of course, any of these firms we've talked about can stop increasing dividends and lose that track record. So just because they're upcoming doesn't mean that they'll actually hit those or that 25-year mark. So this is a picture of the names of the REITs in our own strategy. And one that's missing here is WP Carey, because we haven't updated this strategy yet with that data. And you can see here, if you recognize the tickers, you've got FRT, Essex O, and NNN. And the ones that we've investigated here, we've put a number of variables that we use to kind of try and rank them. And what we ended up holding, and this is based again on this proprietary investment method, is FRT. So that's Federal Realty Trust. That's the firm that's increased for 54 years, and the dividends you can see alongside of that, NNN, and Realty Income. So these are the 3 REITs we're holding. As we mentioned, there's an overlap there between Realty Income and National Realty Retail Properties, that's NNN. And when we looked at building our dividend growth strategy in our own portfolio, we wanted to hold 3 REITs, and based on what was available, these are the names that we chose. Again, Essex Property Trust we didn't want that much exposure to the state of California. We thought that was a fairly big risk. So we chose these three REITs. We've been holding them for quite a long time now. And I guess we could probably at some point in the future look at maybe swapping out national retail properties with WP Carey. But again, that's something that we'd have to look at. That's a decision that would take some time to make. We don't just randomly start switching things out. We like to set it and forget it, as we said earlier. So a couple other quick points to consider. People often talk about valuations. Well, the value of a good company, let's say the valuation of a good company, doesn't change dramatically. And a good example to look at would be Johnson & Johnson. That's a very good quality company. And people often say, well, I won't buy Johnson & Johnson because the yield's too low. Well, you need to be careful about that, because very rarely does the price of Johnson & Johnson dip enough so that the yield is actually high. So you need to be wary in that same manner of high yields. What's most important is consistency. And consistency is an indicator of a great company. That's very important. The firms that we've talked about today, they're all consistent in growing their dividends. That's very difficult to do. It takes a lot of discipline. It takes some very talented management teams to accomplish that using these sophisticated instruments. So that's why we believe the only true indicator of a great REIT is one that can increase its dividend year over year over year. There's no way that you can't fake that growth. And that's what we consider to be a good or a great company, is one that has a track record like these firms we've talked about today. So you have 225 REITs trading on major stock exchanges. Just 2.66% of those have increased their dividend for 25 years or more. And track record is a simple, easy to follow metric. The proof is in the pudding. That's it. You either accomplish that or you don't. So we think beginner and expert REIT investors should really consider these three names we've talked about today. And those would be WP Carey, Federal Realty Trust, and Realty Income. So those are the three names that we think you ought to consider. Please put your comments in the comments section. Make sure to subscribe to our channel. And thanks so much for taking the time to watch this video today.